Welcome to Learning Horizons, a series dedicated to reimagining learning, communicating, and collaborating in remote and hybrid workplace. What is possible? What could be done differently? And what can we do to ignite creativity and performance in the digital world? I am Gail Watson, your host, and today we're going to discuss probably one of the most challenging and controversial topics in learning, how to measure learning impact. I am absolutely delighted to welcome today's guest, Andrew Jacob, with the founder and chief executive officer of Llarn Learning. I've been following Andrew's blogs, Lost and Desperate, for probably over a decade, and as well as his social media feed. I am fascinated by Andrew's unshakable focus on measuring learning performance and his unique ability to always ask the best question. His work on proving impact is as relevant today as it was a decade ago, and he has one of the best podcast voice in the industry. Welcome, Andrew. How are you today?
I have a slight cold, so the podcast voice, which is good, is even deeper today. So my apologies to everybody whose speakers might blow out as a result of me speaking.
So thank you very much for joining us. And I don't think anybody's going to blow up. So maybe before we get started, Andrew, you would like to tell us a little bit more about you, what you do, and also this fascination for measuring impact. Where does it come from?
So thanks, Gail. So thanks for having me on, first of all, and thank you for a very kind introduction. I'm an independent learning consultant. I've worked in learning for about 30 years, and about 15 years ago, I realised that we were doing learning wrong. I was very much one of those who relied on the sage on a stage, and I knew everything. And actually realised that wasn't learning, that was performance art in some form. So went away and did a ton of work looking at, well, actually, what does learning really mean? And found that there was an enormous disconnect between the learning activities that we were undertaking in work and performance. So now I work with organisations on understanding their learning strategy and design and delivery and help them understand how to measure the work they do. And I also work with vendors as well, looking at their products and helping them understand how to place organisations in the best place to demonstrate that using a particular tool does actually have an impact on the performance in an organisation.
That is great. You must be very busy, but it's also very interesting to see that you're working all along the chain of learning. So let's dive in a little bit into what we are here to talk about today, which is what is performance measurement in the context of learning? So what are we talking about?
The key to this is a simple phrase: worry about business, not busyness. We are fabulous at learning and development, at being able to count. We can count the number of times that somebody does something. We can count when they enter, count when they exit, count how happy they are with it. But what we're doing is counting, and we're counting easy, simple data, which is the learning data. What's tougher, and the thing we struggle with, is to measure performance. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, what's the performance benchmark that we're looking to improve? We don't necessarily always establish that at the start. And secondly, even having a standard that we're measuring to, we don't know which elements of data we could and should be looking at. And the whole element of performance management and performance measurement from a learning perspective should be, what's the performance improvement we're looking to change, not just the amount of learning activity that's been undertaken.
Brilliant. So that is very interesting. So already we're touching on data, and we are touching on people in the workplace. So why do you think, actually, yes, before we move on to those two very exciting topics, why do you think we intend to always measure those easy things? I mean, because we've been talking about those elements for a long time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I've been in the industry for over 15 years now, and the conversations were not that different. The tools have changed, and maybe in some way they made it easier, and we can talk about it maybe a bit later. But the challenges remain the same.
So there's a number of reasons for it. Firstly, there were legends. There were legends in learning and development. You know, we've had the legends of learning styles, for example. They've lasted for decades, even though they've been disproved. We've had the legends of evaluation, the idea that we follow a particular model because it came up with the 1950s, therefore it must be correct. And so that's the model that we follow slavishly. We don't want to look for other data, and this is potentially because there's an issue in L&D, is deep in our hearts, know that maybe we're not having the impact that we think we are, which I think is a challenge. So the people who like us. The people who don't like us, well, they don't come to our courses. So, you know, when we to look at the impact that actually happens, what happens if we don't make any impact? Because all of a sudden then we become a cost center. Plus, we're also in a situation where within the learning industry, particularly, the tail wags the dog. Insofar as the vendors and the providers, they tell the profession what's important and what's new, and how technology can help solve these things. And it puts us in a really interesting place that unless the vendors are shifting their thinking around how we evaluate, then the profession won't shift its thinking around how we evaluate, because we are tied inextricably to the technologies and the performance. Tied to the technologies and the systems and process that we have to deliver learning content.
That is true, because if you use a facilitator, for example, the model is normally to pay for a day or half a day. But that means that it is a very brief interventions with limited opportunities for following up. So the whole model is geared up towards an intervention.
I think it's really interesting. So if you were to engage an IT consultant, you wouldn't pay them for a day. What you would do is you would pay them to produce a plan. If you were going to pay an accountant, you wouldn't pay them for a day. You would pay them to produce a set of reports. If you were going to pay a builder, you wouldn't pay them for a day. You would pay them for a completed activity. Yet organisations continue to commission learning and development on the basis of time, as opposed to the end product result that they want to happen.
That is very interesting, and I think it's tied back to what you said, is that then it's become a cost, because if you get people for a longer period of time, it's become a higher cost. So you actually have to do the work at this stage to demonstrate that they have an impact. So let's look now a little bit more about impact as such. So what are the data? You've mentioned data a little bit. So how do we look for data in the business?
So the first thing we need to do is we need to separate out the fact that there are different kinds of data. So I've spent a lot of time looking at data. I was responsible for lateral flow device training in the UK. Remember during COVID where we had to stick things up our noses and so on. I was responsible for designing and delivering the training that went out to organisations, retail, community centres, etc., schools, universities and so on. And from that was able to work through the data and get a sense and understanding of, well, actually what kinds of data are around. And I think that there are four elements of data that as learning professionals that we can look at. The first area of data is to do with input, and within input data, that top left of the grid that we've got there, is we're looking at how people enter our learning activities. So how do they enter? When do they enter? Where do they enter? So are they going digital first, or do they just wander into the training room if it's a face-to-face thing? How they are there. So are they there because they've been recommended? Are they there because they're mandated? Because all of those things will have an element or have an impact rather on how the person feels about the learning that happens. And then we've got output data. So which content do they look at? When do they look at it? How often do they look at it? Which content is reused? We look at who they share with, when they share, how they share. Who are the big sharers? Gail shares with 50 people, Andrew shares with 100 people. But of the 100 people that Andrew shares with, only 6 people pick it up. Of the 50 people Gail shares with, 20 people pick it up. So who's the better sharer? We don't look at sharing in enough detail. And then we don't look at exit either. So just because someone leaves the training, too many people leave training and then they wander away, or they leave the learning activity. What we need to do is to understand the connection between completing this learning activity and completing the next learning activity and then the performance. We don't track what makes the high level of performance. And then lastly, within the output level and training data and the learning data, as you can see on the screen there, is we look at reflection. And we place too much store on the reflection of the individual. We don't necessarily go for the reflection of the line manager, post, but we focus primarily, because we're fixated on this 1950s model, of the reflection of people.
What do you mean the reflection? So the actual thinking about how do we capture it? So
that'd be great if we did that, but what we don't. What we do is we ask them to reflect on the experience.
I see.
They don't reflect on learning; they reflect on the experience. Did you enjoy it? Yes.
How was the biscuit?
It's the favorite thing. You could ask 3 questions at the end of any of those sheets. Is that did you enjoy it? Yes. What would you change? Nothing. What else would you like to say? Thank you. Those are the 3 questions. You can put those questions at the end of any one of those sheets, and those will be the answers.
Well, it's been a long day. You've been there for 6 hours. You've got a train to catch, and at this stage,
exactly.
You go quickly. So the problem. We explored the problem. So we know what we don't capture, and what we should capture. So what do we do to change then? So how do we do to change the approach of the L&D departments?
So I talk about this. I write a book, Proving Impact, and it's all in there. But the key elements is actually have an understanding of, well, where do we pick up that performance data? So that there's output and outcome and impact data, which you can see as performance data. So outcome and impact data comes from these 8 spaces. The first one being baselines. What is the standard? This goes back to my point about measurement. We don't have a metric or a standard that we're measuring to. So the first one is baselines. For example, if you're being asked to produce some leadership and management training, what is the business performance currently and the baseline performance which you are working from? Because there's no point producing a program to say we did a program and everybody enjoyed it. What is the management performance that you are looking to improve as a result of this? Because if you haven't got that and you haven't got clear metrics, it doesn't mean anything. So you have to understand what the baselines are. Secondly is we have to understand repetition. So not repetition of learning, but if somebody learns something, how many times do they have to practice it or do it in performance terms before they become competent? So we're looking at time to competence. Do we factor in time to competence? We don't. Largely what happens is an individual will be sent on training by a line manager and expected when they come out of the training and learning activity to be competent. That's not how learning works. Learning works by creating or by giving people ability and helping them understand their ability, but the capacity for them to perform happens in the workplace. And so we have to understand how long will it take for them to be competent, having left the learning event. And we need to understand what that feels like and what that looks like. We need to control group. We need to test A and B. We need to A and B test and say, let's look at these people, and let's understand how performance has been improved, because it's a really simple way of just testing and seeing if performance has had an impact. We need to look at the estimation to reality. So as part of our baselining, one thing I would expect us to do is to say over 1, 3, 6, 9, 12 months, or 1, 3, 5 quarters, 2, 3, 8 years, whatever the timescale is, we would expect people to be performing. And again, it's tied in with the repetition, but we should be able to sit with someone at the start and go, this is what you expect, this is how long it's going to take them to get there, this is what we'll do, this is what you'll need to do. And it changes the nature of the relationship within learning. We need to understand context. A manager with a team of 3 will perform differently to a manager with a team of 6 in leadership management training. Why? Well, it's in terms of numbers to start off with, but there's all of the relationship stuff. We need to understand some qualitative feedback, but that's qualitative feedback around performance. So it's slightly reflective, but reflective on performance. And then the last 2, business performance and business result. Business performance, we should be looking at a minimum of 3 areas: employee satisfaction and employee data. So managers go on leadership management training. I'm using this one as the example again. If a manager goes on leadership management training, what we expect in respect of churn and turnover? What would we expect in respect of their performance management and their team's performance, sickness, and absence, and grievances and conduct. We should be looking at areas within business performance that look at internal controls. So we should be looking at audit, compliance, mandatory completions, budget, etc., and all of those control elements. And we should also be able to look at customer, internal and external customers, new and existing customers. Because if I'm a manager and I've been developed, then we should start seeing some second level effects through the impact we have on our customers. And then lastly, business results. If you work in a pounds pence business, can we see more pounds and pence as a result of the learning activity you've done through? I've used management development. You could apply these relating to induction. You could apply them relating to sickness absence. You could apply them relating to any instructional activity that you do. These are core central performance metrics that learning and development are just not close enough to at the moment.
That is very interesting. Thank you very much, Andrew, for sharing this. I actually have a follow-up question, if that's actually a couple on that model. The first question is, can we really apply this model like for smaller, like niche, maybe technical topics, content, or, behaviors that maybe impact a small number of people in the organizations? Because, for example, how would you have a control group if, there is a group of 20 people or even 50 people who we just need to upskill?
So within a small organization, your control group won't necessarily be within the organization. What you will be doing is you will be comparing to the profession. You have this in the civil service, for example, where you have departments, but you also have professionals that work across them. So you might have a group, a relatively small group, but you wouldn't be comparing them with another group within the organisation. What you would want to do is to compare them with somebody else, potentially within a profession. So if they work in manufacturing, let's have a look at the quality of the work they do compared to quality of work that's done elsewhere. If they work in a knowledge space, how are they in terms of professional, so say learning development? We train our L&D people. How do we know if they're any good if we're only comparing them within internally? You compare them externally as well. So there will always be a control group, maybe not within your organisation, but outside. That's not to say you would use all of these. You can apply all of these, and you can spend a lot of time going through the evaluation process. But even if you were to pick up 2 or 3 of these, that's going to make an enormous difference on your evaluation practice.
That is brilliant. And that is such a good advice, isn't it? You're not limited to the number of people in your organizations. You can look somewhere else and compare with other type of data, which is becoming I assume a little bit more accessible with the new tools such as AI will give you information about other data. The other question I have is about baselines. Could you give us an example about, what is a baseline? For example, I think we use a management or performance. You use a management or performance example. What would be the baseline?
So it's really interesting. So there's a piece of work that we're looking at the moment, which is a large leadership management program. And the first questions that we have to have with the organisation are, well, what's the baseline performance? So you have a description of what you want it to be. Mm-hmm. Where are you now? So then let's go back to those key metrics. So let's have a look at employee satisfaction. What is it your managers are doing that or not doing that you want them to do, or doing that you want them to stop? And how is that being represented in your organisation? Give us the metrics around that. So is it a churn issue that you've got that you want sorted? Is it that you're not recruiting enough women, you're not promoting enough women, you're not recruiting BAME employees, you have a large disability pay gap, etc.? Is it something protected characteristic-wise? Is it cultural? And what are the cultural points that are happening within the organisation? It could be that you have a number of programs that get to a certain point but never land as fully as they need to. Well, why is that? So we would want to understand the diagnostics that sit in that space in terms of baseline to help understand what we can look to measure at the end of it. So we're not doing the baselines just to oh, well, you're not doing that, you're not doing this. It's to help understand and establish where are we moving to, because without the baseline, why do we do what we do? One of the things that we talk about as well, one of the things that I'm really keen on, is that you have some principles around evaluation as well. And a key one is that, well, if what you do doesn't make any difference, well, why should the organisation keep you there? So the effect on organisational performance can and should always be measured. If you can't measure it, what are you doing?
Well, that is very true, but it is also a little bit tricky because if, for example, you've got issues, you identified issues with the management, there are some probably issues that will take a while to sort. So what sort of, timeline can you put in place to actually track change? What is realistic?
So one of the things that we talk about is the power of 10. So uh, 10 days after doing a learning activity, so what? So the power of 10, you'll be picking up some of the input and output data that's here. So what? You did that learning activity, and so what? And after 10 days, we allow a period of time. The next power of 10 is 10 weeks. So 10 weeks after, we would be, now what? Now, what are you going to do? So we would expect to see some change. Now, we would follow that through. And again, we're looking for qualitative management input as well here. So because it's a three-way approach, it's the organisation, line manager with the individual plus the learning provision. We would look at the 10 weeks later to say, well, now what? Now what are you doing as a result of it? And how are you identifying those baselines? How are you moving things forward? And it's really powerful to then ask that question at that point in time. And we've got a series of questions that we can ask and a series of questions that we work through, surveying tools, focus groups, and so on that we can pull together to make that work. Lastly, the third power of 10, well, it's not lastly, it could be fourthly, but we can go later. But the third power of 10 is about 10 months. So 10 months later, we go, yeah, and what? And what was the effect? And we would be looking at the effect to see what difference that makes. If you haven't seen a difference, well, then why did we do it? And this, again, it's like I said before, one of the problems we've got in learning development, we go back and go, don't want to get found out. Don't want people to find out that what we do doesn't have any impact. So we rarely do this in an appropriate way. I did mention there might be a fourth level, and you could go 10 quarters. So if it's a really longitudinal program, you might go 10 quarters, and you could even go 10 years. They're probably not likely to happen just by nature of the size of the programs that we work on. But 10 days, 10 weeks, and 10 months, those are all measurable periods of time and points in the sand where we can plonk a flag and go, let's have a look and see how we are at that point. And if you establish those up front, and everybody knows about them, the people going on and attending, the participants, plus the managers, you're in a very strong place to then ask some interesting questions around, well, if it didn't make a difference, why not? And if there are other elements in the workplace, then we'll begin uncovering those.
That is very interesting. So it has, well, it just shows as well that it has to be an organizational will. It cannot come from the L&D department. It has to be driven from the top, with everybody being very clear about what's being achieved.
One of the things that I talk about, like I said, is principles. So there are 7 principles, and these are based on something called the Barcelona Principles. Barcelona Principles came out in 2010, and they were principles for marketing. What I did was take them and understand, well, what would they look like if they were principles for learning and development? And so before you even think about developing your strategy, you have a conversation with people internally and go, what really matters in terms of evaluation? And there were 7 principles, and one is, like I said, talks about the effect on organisational performance can and should always be measured. Because if it isn't, then why are you there? And there are other principles, for example, that learning cost figures aren't the value of learning. Just the cost of the learning doesn't tell you the value of the learning. So we need to understand the benefits that go with it. And so there were 7 principles. Again, these are featured in the book, which talk about the background and foundations you have to have before you design your evaluation approaches and strategies.
Well, that is absolutely fascinating, and it is a huge mindset shift. Sorry, it's a mouthful to say. Now, well, we've seen quite a lot, and I know you're very reluctant to go into the tools, though, aspect, Andrew, but I'm still going to push you a little bit down that route, because it hasn't moved, like as we mentioned earlier on, the challenge seems to have been consistent over the past decade, at least, and probably a lot more. That is driven by interventions, by content, and not by behavior change. Now, with the rise of AI, there have been a lot of tools that are advertising, and that's, we're going to not name tools by name because there's a lot of things under the bonnet that are different. But a lot of them are providing, I would say, libraries of behaviors that can be adapted. And while this kind of tools helpful to, for example, create the baseline and measure the progress and could potentially help L&D department to actually start with this kind of shift.
So, you know the story about Henry Ford, where
Yes.
someone said to him, if you were asked to design a car, then all you would have come up with would have been faster horses. You had to think differently outside of the box. And what we don't do in learning development is think outside of that box. What we do is we make everything quicker and better and faster, but within the space that we operate in. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, because it's easier, because we don't want to disrupt the nature of the thing we do. We've done it for years and years, centuries. People have stood in front of other people and talked at them. So we don't want to change that because we assume that that's the way that works. The other problem we have is we have a circumstance right now where the tail wags the dog. We are in an industry where providers tell the profession what is important. And we have situations like this, for example, where shiny technology comes along and learning development looks at the technology and goes, wow, isn't that cool? A few years ago, it was gamification. A few years before that, it was AI. A few years before that, it was something else. And we focus on the tools and without actually looking at the practice that sits underneath it. So that's one of the problems why we don't move. We've got loads of tools, but we just need to think about how we use them differently. And it's not necessarily about a new tool. It's about understanding how to use the tools that you have got better. So if you have, for example, data within your organization's staff surveys and so on that talks about particular areas, understand what that data means in terms of that staff area and do a compare and contrast and see if there is any kind of correlation between that and the learning activity that you do. So do something from the data that already exists and then, start looking at the tools that you need to support that. There are so many tools available. There are. And it's important that people buy the next tool because it's shiny technology. But we don't necessarily always operate like that. We don't need to operate like that. And we have to break that somehow. This is one of the conversations I have with vendors all the time is that tool really going to make a difference or are we just making faster horses?
That is very interesting. However, I do think that if you've got the right mindset, and as you said, you've done the right approach, it is a lot easier today in 2024 to actually look at behavior change and measure behavior change at organization level or even at team level than it was 15 years ago, where you would have to make your own descriptions almost manually. Gather everybody in every single department, get everybody to agree. I mean, it had been a monumental piece of work, and the technology today is able to actually is actually going to help you squeeze in that part. So you still need to do the before, you will probably need to do the after, but that part can be absolutely automated and sped up.
Absolutely. I don't disagree, but there were 4 elements that you need in order to be able to bring something like that in. And the first one is skill. So do you have the skills as a learning development professional to use those tools? So that's the first thing. So, L&D and data don't mix generally very well. And there's a lot of skills in terms of data analysis, bias, understanding the quality of data that we don't get within learning development. The second area that we need to have is the will. So do you have the will and motivation to want to do it differently? And this is what I mentioned before. There is a gap between what we could do and what we do because potentially we don't want to be found out. Those are both internal within the learning function and within individuals in learning development. The skill and the will you can do something about. The two that you can't do anything about are authority and resource. So in terms of resource, is the resource available to you? I'm hearing a great phrase at the moment, BYOAI, bring your own AI. And people are bringing their own AI to work because they're not allowed to use the AI in the workplace. So there's a whole issue around resources that you have available and things you can and can't use. And some organisations quite rightly are throttling back the use of different technologies, and I understand that entirely. So, do you have the resources? Just because the resources are out there doesn't mean everybody can access to them. They're not evenly distributed. And the last part is to do with authority, and there are two forms of authority that you need to have in the organisation to make it work. The first one is you need some power control. You need to have some position in the organisation to say this is how we're going to do things. And you need that hierarchy in order to make it happen. But just that on its own won't be enough. What you also need is social authority. You have to have a presence within the organisation and influence that people know and trust you. If you're a learning function that just produces compliance-based e-learning activity, you won't have that social influence within the organisation because you're the people who put hurdles in people's way. If you say we now want to collect more data, people are going to push back against you because they won't see the benefit. So we need to shift externally how we're perceived. We need to shift the influence that we have and understand what their influence is. I agree entirely. The tools are there and we can use the tools, no question. But it's more than just the tools being there. We need to understand the context, like I said before, about where those things are operating in.
That is brilliant. And it is a big conversations because, to echo what you just said, often the problem is not necessarily the learning department not necessarily wanted to act. It's often the resources and the impact and the influence that the learning department has on other functions that have probably more authority or access to the budget and so on, and then is still boxed in just pushing learning and having the budget cuts at the time like today, when we're starting to look around and said, ooh, we don't really know. We need to make savings somehow, so where are we going to cut? And unfortunately, the Learning and Development Department is often one of the first departments to be cut.
It's value equal value is the perceived benefit divided by the cost. If you haven't got the perceived benefit, if you can't justify the benefits of what you do to the organisation, you will only ever be a cost. And at that point, then you're at risk.
Well, on this very positive ending, thank you very much, Andrew. We all know what we have to get on doing is actually start to gather data about the business to see how we can serve the business better. And it also leads to a bit bigger thinking when your provider is how you are going to help acquiring or, being part of that solutions, and how you're going to shift the way we all work to make sure that we feed into providing the right informations and identify the right data to measure impact. So that was very enlightening. To maybe finish on a slightly lighter note, after that ending, I was wondering, Andrew, the world is changing. We all talk about how we can do differently and how we can work differently now. If you are given technology, given a miracle, given the world has gone in a different way, what would you invest your time learning that you haven't done so far and think, oh, one day I will, when I've got time?
It's a really good question. And it's incredibly relevant to me right now. So I became a grandfather about 3 months ago. And it's really interesting looking at how my grandson, so 3-4 months old, just getting a sense of how he understands the world to be, and how he is making connections and how he is learning. I was holding him yesterday, he popped round, and I was holding onto him yesterday, and he was sitting and he had his hand wrapped around my thumb, and I could feel him pressing, using different fingers, and understand, just to get a sense and building those, those synapses and relationships in his brain as to how the finger was making the how these fingers were working together. And it just made me think, I wish I'd understood more about how we learn at a fundamental level before I started doing learning and development, because everything I've done, it feels like I'm correcting stuff that we've been doing wrong for years and years and years. So I'd like to, if I could go back in time, I'd go back in time and change the way I think about it. And if I was saying to people now is, I understand how people learn now. Don't assume that everything's about pedagogy. Pedagogy is how we educate children. Has anybody heard of andragogy? Because that's about adults. Does anybody know about
Oh,
heutagogy?
yes, no,
Heutagogy,
sorry.
yeah. Heutagogy is the nature of learning just by you know learning from others. We've got rhizomatic learning, which is learning like a rhizome, so going off and finding things out for yourself. Geragogy is a new one, so geriatric learning. So how do older people learn, and how do we learn from older people? There's this whole range of other ways that we can understand about learning that I wish I'd spent more time on.
And I think it's interesting because I just would like to, probably along the same line, we think about learning. Well, your grandson is a lot more likely to learn from you because he trusts you and you're connected with him. And I think this might be something with some people resisting the changes in the way we learn in the corporate world to be more efficient and to train at scale, that this is still an essential part, the trust and the connection. And even though it's possible to learn without that, it's still something that is a little bit of a safety mat, a safety net underneath the learners that they do appreciate.
Everything we learn has come from a person, even if it's in a book, because a
Mm.
person wrote it down. Everything we learn on a screen has come from a person because somebody will have written it, authored it, produced it, created it, recorded it, whatever. So, we learn from people. It's a social activity learning. And that's the thing that stands out most when I'm looking at my grandson. I realise that he's not learning through any screens at all right now. Everything he's learning is through engagement with other people.
And that is wonderful. Well, we're gonna end now. It was a fascinating conversation, Andrew. Thank you for your time. And I hope we are going to inspire people to work slightly differently. All the resources that we've mentioned, your blog and your book, will be listed on the page, as well as some key reading to go through exactly the content you need as you need it. And we are looking forward to learning more and doing things differently. Thank you, Andrew. See you soon.
Thank you, Gail.